I was a corporate officer, a vice president of a bank.
You were a vice president of the bank hanging out in Haight-Ashbury. Did the bank know?
Yeah.
No. No. So the bank didn't know. So you concealed your identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, the flowers in your hair that covered you, right? So did you wear the short dresses and all that?
No.
No.
I had to look corporate.
You had to, no, I'm talking about when you got to, did you go to Haight-Ashbury?
Not a lot.
When you went to Haight-Ashbury, did you wear short dresses?
Yeah.
Yeah. You got to eat dinner with her tonight and find out the rest of the story. Because I'm only going to be here for another 20, 25 minutes. So you knew all about the hippie culture.
Oh, definitely.
Oh, did you live the hippie culture while you were there?
No, I couldn't because I had to have a corporate life.
Oh, you had to have a corporate life, so you eavesdropped on them. So, and had a good time with them.
Right.
Did you party with them?
Not quite so much.
Okay. See, I should have been a lawyer, right? Because I've gotten her to admit a couple things without trying. Anyway, I hope it's all in fun.
Yeah.
It's all in fun. So I won't tell anybody. It's 52 years later, statute of limitations is over, you know, right? Nobody's going to say anything 52 years later. So I'm glad you enjoyed your time there. And this was the funeral for the hippies. The hippies did have a funeral because as the summer ends, they go back. You went back to your corporate lifestyle of the bank, and everybody, all the hippies go back, and that's the end of Haight-Ashbury. It's really the end of the hippie movement because we don't know what the hippies exactly stood for because they had no ideology. They went to San Francisco and had a good time. That's the hippie funeral. Haight-Ashbury deteriorates. There's overcrowding. You probably saw too many people there, right? There was homelessness. There was hunger. There were drug problems. There was crime in the neighborhood. Many people left in the autumn to go back to college or to go back to a bank. And so all of a sudden on October 6, 1967, the diggers decide they're going to have a mock funeral, and it's all about the death of the hippie. Now George Harrison was in Haight-Ashbury. Now George Harrison, you would think, would be the gentleman hippie. The Beatles were a hippie band. Every hippie listened to it and tried to figure out, what does that lyric mean? What does I am the walrus mean? It must mean something. It must be I love to turn you on must mean something. But George Harrison there with his then wife Patty Boyd said, I went there expecting a brilliant place with groovy gypsy people making works of art and painting and carvings in little workshops. But it was filled with horrible, spotty, dropout kids on drugs, and it turned me right off the scene. I can only describe it like a Bowery. Lots of bums and dropouts. Did you find that when you were there? It was like the Bowery in some cases? You found that too. Many of them young kids who dropped acid came all over America to this mecca of LSD. George Harrison claimed he quit taking LSD after he was in San Francisco. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan is the governor of California, and Ronald Reagan is a law and order guy, a conservative guy, but he's putting up with the hippies in San Francisco. But Ronald Reagan says of the hippies, a hippie is someone who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, smells like Cheetah. Somebody had to write that line for him. Somebody, maybe it was from the show Daktari or Wild Kingdom. Ronald Reagan certainly wasn't from Death Valley days and 20 Team Borax. Meanwhile, as all this is going on, withdraw the troops from Newark, New Jersey. Newark, New Jersey. Get the troops out of Newark, New Jersey. 1967 may have been the summer of love for some people, but for others it was the summer of misery and rioting. Primarily in the East Coast. 1964 Civil Rights Act wasn't taking effect. All of a sudden, African Americans, Midwest cities, East cities, Milwaukee, Buffalo, Tampa, Cincinnati, 100 deaths, millions upon millions of dollars worth of damage. Some of it, you go to downtown Detroit today, you can see the damage from 1967. You go to downtown Newark, you could see some of the leftovers from the damage of the riots in 1967. Burnt out neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods never fully recovered. I was talking to somebody in New Jersey last week, and they were asking me, well, what do you got planned? I said, I'm working on this 1967 talk. And he said, my uncles owned a store in Newark, New Jersey during the rioting. And they made sure they were in that store 24 hours a day to make sure that the store was spared. If the store was closed, they were going to burn it. But if there were people in the stores, they weren't going to burn it. Their business lasted. There are scars still in the country since 1967. Newark, New Jersey. National Guard troops. Newark. Take a look at that picture. United States, Newark, New Jersey. June 27th, a race riot erupts in Buffalo. 200 people are arrested. Race riot, Newark, New Jersey, July 12th. 26 people dead, 1,500 injured, 1,000 arrested. Race riots in Cairo, Illinois. Race riots in Durham, North Carolina. 43 people die. Race riot in Detroit. 1,000 people injured, 442 fires set. I was in Detroit a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, and there are ruins, literally ruins, that are still standing. Race riots erupt near Baltimore, in Cambridge, Maryland, near Baltimore. Race riots in Detroit forced the postponement of a Detroit Tigers-Baltimore Orioles game. Soul Brother, tractor, cleaning out people, making sure that people aren't around anymore. Down south, a local guy with a gun offering to help out National Guard to quell the riots. Civilians involved. The unrest was a reaction to a large problem. There was a deep-seated anger in the inner cities, hopelessness, disenfranchisement, the urban communities, rates of poverty high, joblessness high, crime, it just wasn't in proportion to the rest of the country. And the long, hot summer simmered. Lyndon Johnson's the president. He's the guy who signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. And that's John Lindsay there. John Lindsay has a big place in my heart because without John Lindsay, I don't have my first scoop in 1978, and I don't get onto WNEW radio for 3.5 years. He told me he was running for governor of the state of New York. I like you. I want to tell you something. You don't know me. I'm telling you because I like you. That's John Lindsay, and they're talking. Johnson has a commission called the Kerner Commission, and it's a bipartisan task force, and they want to know why the cities are erupting, why the civil disorders. It's named after Otto Kerner. He is the governor of Illinois, and the committee asks these 3 major questions. What happened? Well, we know what happened. Why did it happen? We don't know why it happened. What could be done to prevent it from happening again? It takes a while for the Kerner Commission to come back. There's John Lindsay again, another day. John Lindsay, my friend. Key to my career. So there's Lyndon Johnson, and this is what the Kerner Commission said could be a fix. Create 2 million new jobs, 6 million new affordable housing units, revamp the welfare system, eliminate de facto school segregation. You had your good schools, you had your bad schools in the bad neighborhoods. Eliminate abrasive police practices and establish redress mechanisms. One thing that happened in 1968, you couldn't discriminate against anybody in housing anymore. That came after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Here's one that's rather interesting. Improve news coverage of problems facing black Americans. Go into the inner city with your TV cameras. Report. Make local government more responsive to inner city communities. Lyndon Johnson would eventually back off the Kerner Commission. In fact, he would disavow it. Meanwhile, you might remember this because in 1968, you might have bought the book called The Kerner Commission Report. Because 2 million copies were sold. It was on the bestseller list of the New York Times. But all of that book, all of everything else would soon disappear after 1968 because Lyndon Johnson claimed he didn't get enough credit for helping to put the lid on things. He wasn't given enough credit for passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Johnson was so upset with all this, he never met with the commission again, and the thing just disappears in 1968.
Would you excuse me?
Yes. Now there was a coup in Greece in 1967. 30 years after the war, national divisions, forces in right and left. It was traced back to World War II after liberation in 1944. These guys take over Greece. And these guys impose a military junta on Greece. And they decide, let's get over, they were the government in exile, we're the government now, we're going to kick out the king and we're going to kick out everybody else. People didn't like it, guilty. Greek military militia, long live a democratic Greece. There was limitations on people, free elections suspended. It was illegal to strike. It was illegal to talk against the government, demonstrate. And you could not congregate in Greece except if you went to church. The regime would fall in 1974. There was another war that started in 1967, one that you probably saw on TV commercials in 1968. And you probably saw images like that. It was in Nigeria. And it was Biafra, a part of Nigeria that wanted to break away. The Nigerian army surrounded the Biafrans by 1968, and this is when you started to see images like this. Images like that, CARE, asking you to send money to help people dying from famine, dying of starvation, like this kid. And all of a sudden, there's a worldwide attention put on the Biafran war, not because it's a war, but because there's effective television commercials. All of a sudden, you see that. The Republic of Biafra was a state in Western Africa, started on May 30th, 1967, and was made up of states in the eastern region of Nigeria. Here are some of the war scenes in that war. It starts on July 6, 1967. The Biafrans had a national aspiration of becoming a country. They felt they could no longer exist with the rest of the Nigerians in the northern part. They were in control. Biafra was recognized by Gabon, Haiti, Ivory Coast, Tanzania and Zambia. People that offered assistance included Israel, France, Spain, Portugal, Norway, Rhodesia, South Africa, Vatican City. Tons and tons of TV commercials aimed at pulling at your heartstrings because there was a famine. By 1968, it was all over, except the shouting. Biafra got the port city. There was a blockade, mass starvation, 100,000 military casualties, between 500,000 and 2 million Biafran civilians died from starvation. And those commercials were on and on and on. Send to care, send the care package, we'll get it to Biafra. That war was over by 1970, and that was the flag of Biafra. There are still pockets of resistance looking to separate from Nigeria all these years later. The British government got involved to help the Nigerians. Eventually, the Biafrans in 1970 would surrender to Nigeria. How many of you saw the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Remember the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? This couple, their last name, the Lovings. They live in Virginia, and they decided to get married. The Supreme Court of the United States heard arguments in the Loving versus Virginia case in April 1967. Mildred Jeter married Richard Loving. It was an interracial couple. They got married in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s, but their marriage was not recognized in Virginia. They decided to sue Virginia. They were charged, after getting married, with breaking the state's law which banned interracial marriage, and were jailed. The Lovings sued the state of Virginia. They argued the ban violated the 14th Amendment and was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, in a decision 6-3, that states' bans on interracial marriage were unconstitutional and they were based solely on racial discrimination. The decision made interracial marriage legal in the United States in 1967. Remember this movie?
Yeah.
Sidney Poitier. Guess who's coming to dinner? It was one of the few films that actually showed an interracial marriage in a positive light. Interracial marriage in 1967, when that movie came out, was still illegal in 17 states, mostly in the South, and would be until June 12, 1967, 6 months before the film finally comes out. The film came out later on in that year. It's another demonstration, the first of the college demonstrations. 1967, February 1967, University of Wisconsin-Madison, students blocked offices in Bascom Hall to protest the recruitment efforts on campus by Dow Chemical. Dow Chemical was making things like Agent Orange in Vietnam. They also made napalm. Napalm, a flammable gel that burned victims horribly. They decided to go after Dow. And this continues and continues and continues until it hits a crescendo October 17th and 18th, 1967. Oddly enough, I gave 2 talks, not in 1967, 2 separate places in New Jersey. One, a mother of and she was in her 90s, of one of the students who was in Wisconsin during this, another who was actually in the protest in 1967. The protest at University of Wisconsin was not against Vietnam, it was about Dow Chemical. But it's credited with being the first college demonstration against Vietnam. But they were going after Dow for making napalm. On October 18th, the protest became violent, as you can see. Cops taking down the protesters, University of Wisconsin. The protest made national news. University of Wisconsin at Madison was thrust into the forefront of the anti-war demonstrations. It was the first. More demonstrations. That was the Pentagon, outside the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. U.S. troops using rifles to quell the demonstrators. This is what's going on in 1967, 2 months prior to 1968, which allegedly people say changed the United States. That started October 21st, 1967. Meanwhile, there's another side to this. There were pro-Vietnam people out there. And this is in Massachusetts. And this is a pro-war demonstration in Massachusetts in 1967. Paul Christopher organized it. He was 19 years old. He got 25,000 people in Wakefield, Massachusetts to support the troops in Vietnam. Christopher became tired of seeing all of the anti-war protests, and this also starts the America Love It or Leave It movement. Twiggy! Remember Twiggy? How many women wanted to be as skinny as Twiggy? You wanted to be as skinny as Twiggy? Why? Why?
She was beautiful.
She was beautiful. Twiggy was 17 years old. She was the model, she was the first, she probably was the first model that achieved that status. She arrives in New York in March of 1967. There was a Twiggy phenomenon in 1967. The New Yorker magazine devoted 100 pages to her. She was the first supermodel. International sensation, modeling in France, Japan, America, and of course in England. How many of you have this today? Who doesn't have one of these today? You don't. Well, this guy has one. In 1967, as we end 1967, this guy has one of those phones that they promised at the World's Fair. I don't know if you went to the 64, 65 World's Fair, but Bell Telephone had an exhibit where you're going to be able to be on the phone and talk to somebody and see them. Well, you could if you had $15,000 in 1967 and you were in Japan. The Nippon Electric Company came up with a one-channel setup. It was a multi-channel video phone that was invented, and you could get one channel to see somebody on the other end, and it would only cost you about $1,300 to $1,500. They set that up in 1967, and that is the predecessor of what you use today, or some of us use today, the phone. And robots, actually computer. Computer is playing chess. Artificial intelligence 52 years ago. The computer was playing chess. The computer was known as Robert Q. It was in Boston, January 21st of 1967. The computer was programmed at MIT, which must have said...
It's interfering with this gentleman.
Here, we'll just close
Yeah.
the door.
In 19... We're almost done. We're almost done. We're at the end. In 1967, this computer is programmed by MIT, which must mean that the computer is smart, because it is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Carl Wagner was the opponent. He was at the YMCA several miles away. The moves were relayed by not computer, not internet, because there's no internet until 1969, but by old-fashioned teletype. Samuel B. Morse in 1967. Computers are playing humans. There was a World's Fair in Montreal. Anybody go to Montreal, Expo 67 Montreal? Did you go? Anybody go? That's me in 1982 with what's left of Expo 67 Montreal. That's still there. I had hair once, 1982. Come on, come on, come to Montreal. Expo 67 Montreal. The World's Fair was held April 27th till October 29th, 1967. It's considered the most successful World's Fair in the 20th century. It celebrated Canada's 100th anniversary. If you ever go up to Prince Edward Island, I'm going back up to Prince Edward Island in October. Hopefully all this is gone. They're renovating Confederate Hall. This is the place where Canada became a country in 1967 in Charlottetown, PEI. It's undergoing extensive renovation. Hopefully when I'm there in October, I'll actually get to look at Confederate Hall. The odd thing about Canada forming, it was Nova Scotia at that point, it was Quebec at that point, New Brunswick. The meeting is held in Prince Edward Island in 1867. Prince Edward Island is hosting this meeting to form Canada. Guess what province doesn't join Canada in 1967? Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island had a railroad that they couldn't pay for, and they shopped around the island looking for somebody to buy the island or help pay for the railroad. They even went to Ulysses S. Grant in about 1870 and said, please, please, make us part of the United States and pay the bill. Eventually, Canada would pay the bill in 1873. So they were celebrating the 100th anniversary of Canada in 1967. And finally, anybody on the 20th century limited trade that took you cross country? Its final run, Chicago, was on December 4th, 1967. It ran between Chicago and New York in 1902, and there's the 20th century limited. One last thing, I hate talking about health. I don't like people talking to me about their health problems or my health problems. I just can't deal with it. I'd rather talk about something else, but I am going to talk about health now. On December 3rd, 1967, Dr. Christian Barnard transplanted the heart of an accident victim, Denise Darvall, into the chest of Louis Orchevsky. Orchevsky eventually would become conscious. He was talking to his wife. He would die 18 days later, not of the heart transplant, but of complications. He had pneumonia. It was a successful heart transplant. Today, heart transplants seem to be routine. 52 years ago, Dr. Christian Barnard in South Africa did the first one. He is there, and he is one of the people who changed the world in 1967 for the positive. Any questions, comments, criticisms? Somebody's got to have something to say. You were all there except for you two. Now, you two weren't there in 1967. Do you think you missed anything?
Yeah, sounds like it.
It sounds like, what, the drugs? The LSD? Tune in, turn on, drop out?
Sounds
You were
like
born
it.
in the 1990s.
Yeah, I was.
Did you ever hear about this stuff?
I've heard about it.
You've
but
heard about
not
it.
in school, really.
In school, did you hear about, there was once a group called the Beatles, you know?
Do you like them?
Yeah, oh, you do like them. Okay, they once existed. There was once, Jimi Hendrix once played the guitar at Monterey. Burned the guitar, right? Burned the guitar at Monterey. So, and if you go on to San Francisco, you don't go to San Francisco now with flowers in your hair. Besides, flowers wouldn't fit me anymore. Any comments? Well, thank you so much. This was the first time out for me on this thing. So, any criticisms I'm open to because, like I said, this was the first time out. And it's not like I've done 1968 100 times or 1969 like 50 times. Anything that you were, besides my corporate banker friend back there, anything else that you remember from 1967? Were you married in 1967? How many of you were married? I know you were 17. Any of you married? You were married in 1967? Did you have kids?
Yes.
That's why you probably didn't get involved, because you were busy raising kids, which is what some people tell me. Thank you so much. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.